we did a ranking. I think people were like, oh man, Le Chiffre's such a great character. He's such the best villain. After watching this movie, I'm like, is he? It's kind of lame. He's kind of a lame character.
He turns out to be more of like a middle bad guy, which makes sense for a Bond, first as a 00 agent.
Le Chiffre.
Well, let me stand up for Le Chiffre for a minute. The reason he is so beloved is, of course, because he is complex. He and Bond never throw a punch, and that's not just a sign of a good villain, but the sign of a great villain. I've said in the past that when it comes to female characters, there's a tendency to simply judge them as physically strong or not strong, and that's that, which is a lazy and boring assessment programmed into us by contemporary social politics. People tend to do the same thing with bad guys. Uncreative bad guy stories often fall back on fight scenes and punch for punches, and that's boring and uninteresting because they are predictable and often very one-sided. Le Chiffre is what you would get if Boris Grishenko was made a primary villain. The man is all brains and very little brawn. If he went up against Bond, he would predictably get his ass kicked. This is what makes Le Chiffre so interesting and not boring, because on top of this is a very un-Bond villain-like predicament of being a desperate middleman. This is a rare case where the bad guy is ultimately killed by other bad guys, which only serves to highlight the complexity of this character's desperate predicament, with Bond on one side,
I will take a hand for this betrayal, but you needed to blink out.
His own clients hunting him, and Mr. White on the other. Something that physically manifests as this guy literally weeping blood. How many times have y'all heard me go on about the importance of a connection between Bond and bad guy beyond the physical? The movie could have just pitted these two against each other in a boring punch for punch, which is what we're teased with when Bond grabs the steak knife to go handle Le Chiffre physically.
James, get the girl out.
Such a thing takes little effort story-wise and is ultimately boring. Instead, these men return to their real battleground, the poker table. We even see an echo of the free-running scene where Le Chiffre is always very precise and smooth with his chip handling. And then there's Bond aggressively splashing the pot. Bond and Le Chiffre battle with words and looks quite reminiscent of our other greatest Bond villain, Goldfinger. Everything at the Casino Royale takes the Goldfinger golf scene to a whole new level, which actually takes effort far and away beyond a simple battle of fists. Because as Bond explains in the train scene,
in poker you never play your hand. You play the man across from you.
Poker isn't just hoping for the best cards, but about assessing the man on the other side of the table and reading his bluffs. In order to do so, Bond continuously plays provocateur with Le Chiffre, starting with breaking his cover and using his real name.
James Bond. You'll find the reservation under Beach.
Welcome, Mr. Bond.
Welcome, Mr. Beach. Was that Bond? I'm a little confused.
Well, we wouldn't want that, would we?
Earlier in the film, M says,
arrogance and self-awareness seldom go hand in hand.
Later, Bond says to Vesper,
ironically enough, makes it less likely for her to be accepted and promoted by her male superiors, who mistake her insecurities for arrogance.
Which is what Vesper herself begins to believe about Bond.
Very funny.
Look, if Le Chiffre is that well connected, he knows who I am and where the money's coming from, which means he's decided to play me anyway. So he's either desperate or he's overly confident, but either way, that tells me something about him. And all he gets in return is a name he already has.
She begins to mistake his confidence and calculated plays as egotism.
And now he knows something about you. He knows you're reckless. Take the next one. There isn't enough room for me and your ego.
When really it's all part of Bond's strategy. When Bond loses a hand on purpose, Vesper sees this as Bond not being a good poker player.
You're losing so fast we won't be here past midnight.
Bond then explains that he did so on purpose to discover Le Chiffre's tell.
It was worth it to discover his tell.
He had the best hand.
Which he got on the last card. The odds against were 23-1, and he'd know that. When he did his first raise, he had nothing. Winning was blind luck.
Maybe he can actually pull this off.
And that's Bond's relationship to Le Chiffre, not punching him until he relents physically, but provoking and probing him for weaknesses that he can exploit. Bond does this so well that Le Chiffre, in his desperation, seeks to remove Bond from the game by whatever means necessary, essentially cheating, because his very life is at stake. Their relationship escalates to, not a fight scene, but a torture scene, where Le Chiffre, just like Goldfinger, ties Bond to a chair and threatens to permanently emasculate him. Just as Bond bluffs Goldfinger to let him live,
you know nothing, Mr. Bond.
Operation Grand Slam, for instance.
Bond tells Le Chiffre that no matter what he does, he won't give up the password.
The password, please.
The question is Bond bluffing?
I've got a little itch. Down there. Would you mind? Yes! 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 Now the whole world's gonna know that you died scratching my balls!
Instead of breaking free of the chair using some Q gadget and beating up Le Chiffre, the scene continues on this higher level of storytelling. Le Chiffre calls his bluff and threatens to feed Bond his own, PPK.
I'll feed you what you seem not to value.
This is where Mr. White begins his final manipulation of Bond by killing Le Chiffre in front of him in order to later secure the password using Vesper. All of this added up makes Le Chiffre just as unique and complex as our Bond girl. Not a classic Bond villain hell-bent on destroying the world or enriching himself for the sake of power, but rather enriching himself for the sake of survival. So is Le Chiffre kinda lame? Well, yeah. And that's exactly what makes him such a fresh and compelling Bond villain.